Welcome back. In this video, we are going to talk about the formation of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries in 1960s, and we are going to learn a little bit about their operation starting from 1960s to the recent years. We are not going to, go into the great details of the operation of OPEC, but this is only just to give you a broad overview because the operation of OPEC, how they manage the market, how they sort of manage the price, it has a lot of layers, and the literature can, if you are interested, you can go into the deep into the literature. I have posted some of the websites from the links from the OPEC's website, which have really useful information. And there are a lot of controversy as well around the functionality of OPEC. However, we'll try to avoid those. We'll mainly focus on how exactly they controlled the production and price of the oil market since 1960s. If you remember these phases that we discussed in the previous two lectures, and we divided it into the pre-OPEC era and the post-OPEC era. Now here what we are going to do in this video, we are going to talk about the era that the world experienced in the international oil market after the formation of OPEC in 1960s. So we have divided it into, basically here I have written it three, but we divided it into multiple parts. One is the formation of OPEC and its early year, which covers from 1960 to 1973. Then we speak about 1970s, where the world experienced a couple of oil price shocks. And then we discuss about 1980s, where the demand stabilization came into the force, and more power for OPEC was realized in terms of supply determination and price fixing. And then we also we also talk a little bit about the last 2 decades. Let us first have a quick look at the genesis of this Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, that is OPEC, in 1960s. How did the world look like at that very point of time? See, we saw that, in the early phases of the 20th century, the oil market internationally was dominated mostly by US and sometimes, by Mexico as well. However, in the middle of the 20th century, you see that there is a shift from the emphasis on US and Mexico to the Middle East countries. We have already discussed that how by that time US actually became a net importer of oil instead of being the net exporter of oil. So US was also looking for the sources of cheap oil. The same period of time, the production of the oil export, this Middle East countries, it grew, and it was realized that the cost of production in these Middle East countries are much lower than US. And therefore, slowly these Middle East countries, since the beginning of 20th century, they started gaining sort of importance in the world international oil market. Now, if you look at the supply and price trend in early, 1960s or, late 1950s, this is the period where the production of oil was little higher. The supply was a little higher as compared to the demand, and it was actually marked by the era of falling price. There was a supply glut, and therefore there was a falling price of oil market. And we have also observed that the posted price that was there, it was actually higher than the actually market transaction price that was taking place, because of several benefits given to the buyer for the long term by the seller of oil, in order to ensure the sell of whatever they are producing. Now, why this was difficult for, having a low price was very difficult for this kind of an industry to sustain. If you again go back to our discussion in the previous week and the week before, we have seen, especially in the context of monopoly when we were discussing, we have seen that these energy industries are the kind of industry where the capital cost is much, much higher and the running cost is relatively low. And if an industry has this kind of a cost feature, that is high investment and low running cost, then in order to avoid or minimize the operational loss, what they usually do is that they have a tendency towards near full capacity production. So they want to produce as much as they can. They often do not follow, or they rarely actually follow, the marginal cost pricing. Now, this tendency of operating towards the near full capacity actually increased the supply in the market, and this also depressed the price. Now, this is the period where a lot of concessions were in place. So many of the foreign companies were actually operating in the host countries, who were owning, or who actually had, no, I won't say owning, but who actually had the reserve of oil. And when when there is a decline in price, automatically what happened, the revenue generated by these production companies, it fell. As a result, that the royalty that they paid to the host company, the host nations, that also came down. And this actually adversely affected the revenue bill that was generated, or that was gained by the host countries. So everything was going not quite in favor of the producer of oil and oil product at this point of time. If you look at economically and politically, this was the changing landscape in the world. So where many interesting things happened at this point of time. There was a lot of decolonization which was going on in the world. Many new countries emerged with their new vision towards economy. New activities were supposed to come up, and there was also a very significant emphasis on the point of nationalization, right? And one form in which this was manifested is in the form of that everybody started arguing that this concession should go away from the oil market. So it should not be the case that a foreign company should come and have the ownership to the subsoil natural resources, take it out, carry on the business, and pay only the royalty to the host country. There was a lot of emphasis that it should go away. This is the period at which the OPEC came up, because these Middle Eastern countries, they realized that they can gain a lot from the market if they act together. Probably they can influence the price as well by kind of targeting the supply, to understand the supply, understand the demand, and then produce accordingly. So in 1960, the genesis of OPEC was the Baghdad Conference, and there were five member countries who were the founder members of OPEC. They are Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. Now, Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, they are very important powers. So in OPEC, it's often said that the world price of oil is determined by the fact how much production Saudi Arabia is going to come up with. So they are very important players. They have a lot of reserve. They supply a lot of oil in the world market, and they have the control over the price. However, I'm not talking about 1960s. At that point, OPEC did not have a very significant dominance over oil price in the world market. If you look at the present scenario, there are 14 member countries of OPEC. So the member countries keep on changing. The new member countries come. Sometimes, their memberships are cancelled, or they withdraw from OPEC, and so on. So the founder members are constant, these five. However, the rest of the member countries keep on changing. Now, as I have said, that this was there was a supply glut, the price was depressing, everybody wanted to produce more. However, there was not much demand, and additionally, the fact is that the newly formed nations, they came up with a strong idea of sovereignty, and they wanted to do away with the concession. And the OPEC acted in the similar line at this point of time. If you look at the declaratory statement of petroleum policy of the member countries that was adopted in 1968, there was a strong emphasis that was laid on how the countries should exercise their permanent sovereignty over their natural resources in the interest of national development. So this is the genesis, and this is how OPEC started functioning in 1960. Although in 1960s you will see that OPEC did not have much power to fix the price in the world international oil market. There are a few very important facts which helps us understanding why OPEC emerged as one of the very important and strong market power in the international oil market. Nearly 80% of world proven oil reserve is with the OPEC member countries. And 50% of this 80% is with Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. And that is why they are such big players in the oil market. OPEC member countries produce approximately 40% of total world's crude oil. So they have a dominance in the production sector as well. They have a very significant share in the export as well, although in the recent times the share of OPEC in export has been declining, and that has become a point of concern for the OPEC member countries in the recent times. Finally, OPEC not only plays in the field of international oil market, but it has the natural gas reserve as well. So it owns more than 4/5 of global crude oil reserve and more than 48% of global natural reserve. So even if in future you see that there is a shift from gas to shift from crude oil to natural gas, OPEC is likely to continue play a significant role in the world trade. Let us now come to the first decade of operation of OPEC. As we have said that there was not much price fixing power with the OPEC member countries. They focused on two short term targets that they wanted to achieve. See, the price stabilization is always one very important thing that OPEC wanted to achieve. Now, whether you have the power to fix the price, or whether you have you go some in a roundabout way, do some economic corrections to stabilize the price. So in the initial phase, as I said, OPEC did not have the power to fix the price. All they did, they went through some economic logic to moderate or to alter the supply and to alter the concession, and therefore to change the price regime. They had two most important objectives that they had to achieve. One was the production control and price, and the second was nationalization of concessions. So if you look at the production controls, the OPEC countries, they together realized that at the heart of this reduction in price or low or depressed price, there is the high supply from the countries. This is one of the main reasons. So production control was initiated in the early phases of OPEC. However, it was not very successful during this decade. The second thing that they did in order to recover the price was the discontinuation or reduction in market allowance that actually lowered the price. You remember in last week we had a discussion that whatever was the posted price, usually the market price was lower than that, because the selling companies wanted to give a number of concessions to the buyer in order to secure the sale of their product. They also worked on expensing the royalties and increasing the tax reference price, which was the posted price, which will be reflected in a higher market price. So this is one way that they work. The second that we already discussed, nationalization of concession. The manifesto that we discussed was published in 1968. It encouraged the nationalization of previously given concessions, right? So we saw that in, for example, in Iran the concession was given, and this foreign company was actually operating in a nation where the nation did not have sovereign power or ownership of on the natural reserves that it had. So OPEC actually encouraged to do away with this situation. The one more important thing that they did, they made an arrangement to buy back the oil. So what was the buyback? See, although the drive was towards own the natural reserve, when the oil is produced, these countries actually did not have the infrastructure to refine and also to distribution. For the technological know-how, they actually had to rely on these foreign companies. So what they did, they negotiated that the foreign companies would actually purchase the producer's share of oil. However, that was at a lower price as compared to the market price. During the first phase, through different negotiations, OPEC was actually successful to come up with some long-term pact with these companies, where they were able to raise the price of some very it's called the sodalite, the very fine quality of oil, by 21%. They increased the tax from 50 to 55%, and there was an escalation. They agreed that there will be an escalation of price by 2.5% in the years when it faces the inflation. However, this pact was only, in practice till 1976, then it was done away with. Now, one very crucial feature that you can observe here, that when we talk about earlier also, when we were discussing in terms of, the Standard Oil company, we were talking about the rise of the Seven Sisters and so on. The cartel, or even if I don't call it cartel, the understanding was between a few companies, right? So the group was formed by a few companies. But now if you look at OPEC, this is the intergovernmental body. So now the national governments are coming into the picture in order to kind of determine the fate of the oil market. It's no longer the single companies who are coming together and coming agreeing to do something. So this is a very different idea of cartel, or this is a very different idea of coming to an agreement to have some monopoly power in the market. So this is a strong deviation that you see, or departure that you see, from the pre OPEC era to the post OPEC era. One more important thing, the website that is given here, this is the website of OPEC. It's interesting to go through the website for a lot of information. However, I would urge you to go through other documents. There, plenty of them, they are available on the website to understand what is the critique that you have with respect to formation and the functioning of OPEC as well. Next, we come to the period of 1973 to 1981. This was a very, very crucial period, not only for the history of OPEC and international oil market, but I would say this was a rupture point in the history of energy. Or economic, political, energy related. It determined a course of a lot of things. So, in the initial lectures, we talked about how energy became a scarce resource. What was the point at which it was realized that energy is not available in abundance? So, this is the period of time, right? So, there was Yom Kippur War, where Arab countries and Israel was engaged, and certain developed nations, certain Western nations, US, Netherlands, along with Portugal and South Africa, they actually supported Israel in the war. As a result, what the Arab countries did, they actually imposed an embargo to the supply of oil to these countries: US, Netherlands, Portugal, and South Africa. They said they're going to reduce the supply of oil to these countries significantly, and they also decided to reduce their production by 25%. So 5 million barrel per day, okay, was reduced. Production of 5 million barrel per day was reduced. So there was a huge reduction in the supply of oil at this point of time following the war. At the same time, they also declared unilaterally the tax reference price that was forced, and price indeed increased during this period from 3 USD per barrel to 12 USD per barrel. Right? So this is not the shock, but this is only the fixation of the tax reference period. Now, what happened as the moment OPEC, sets the embargo and declares that there is going to be a supply cut, the demand increased as a shock. So a lot of demand came in the form of the panic buying, as the countries actually feared that in future there is going to be a huge shortage of supply, and there could be problems with imported oil and so on. And now this is the point when the countries are actually dependent on the oil. So everybody got scared and everybody wanted to buy some stock for it. So you see the situation, there was a decline in supply to a great extent. There is a sudden increase in demand, and as a result, the price shot up. So the price shot up to 12 USD per barrel towards the end of 1974, which was 3 USD per barrel in 1973. So there was a sharp increase, and this is for the first time world experienced this kind of an increase in oil. So, this is the period when the world realized that the era of cheap oil is over, and several other energy related issues gained importance. For example, import substitution. It was explored how the domestic reserve, how the domestically available energy can be utilized in a better manner. People started talking about energy efficiency policies, started revolving around this. The discussion was about import substitution. The discussion on demand side management came into the force, and also that the nation started talking about the possibility of using renewable energy. So this oil price shock, this again, I mean, this is a recap of what we have done in our previous lectures. So this is a deciding era of the energy economics and energy policy in a sense. So this is something unprecedented to the world, and it forced the world to think in a very different line. How do you actually move away from oil and think about other things as well? There was another shock in this period of time that was due to Iranian revolution, not really from any geopolitical turmoil in a sense, but Iran's international revolution and all. And following the second thing, and Iran actually at that point of time reduced their production. Not only Iran, certain other Middle Eastern countries, they engaged into disputes, and there was a decline in the supply. Again, there was a panic buying and so on. So decline in supply, increase in demand. As a result, there was a second shot up in price, and price towards the end of towards the end of 1979, it was hit the mark of 24 US dollar per barrel, which was very very high. So you can imagine that it was 3 US dollar per barrel in 1973. Within a period of 5 6 years, it becomes 24 US dollar per barrel. It increased further, and in 1981 the price was 34 billion dollar 34 dollar per barrel. So from 1973 to 1981, the increase in price was from 3 US dollar per barrel to 34 US dollar per barrel. So this was something unprecedented. I mean, this had never happened in the world. There is one more important thing that had happened in this period of time. You can see through all these things that is happening in 1970s, OPEC could show that it had a power to set the price of the oil. So the decision of OPEC to supply or not to supply oil can actually influence the market price. So this is the period when OPEC gained, the power to determine the market price or to influence the market price, and this was also the end of the era of the the posted price that we discussed. Here the OPEC sets up a new body to decide how they can manage the price in the world market. They started setting the price in the world market and so on. They also declared the unilateral tax reference price. However, following the shocks, the market price rose over and above what OPEC determined as to be the market price. So they, started having some control over the price, but this kind of situation actually overshot the price over and above what was anticipated by the OPEC. Then we come to an interesting phase of 1980s. So this is the period you can imagine just in the previous decade the world experienced two very important oil price shocks. And OPEC started having the power to decide the market price in the international market. However, but what OPEC can do, it can, kind of, it can work or it can maneuver over the supply side. It doesn't have much of, control over the demand side per se. Now, given the two oil shocks, there was a significant shift because of the national policies, because of the scare that people had that what will happen if the import is stopped. There was a significant shift away from the oil as a source of energy. People started exploring other sources. The other thing is that the world also realized that the OPEC has significant market power, and therefore if you rely on OPEC, only OPEC for your import, then geopolitically and energy security wise you are extremely vulnerable. So in 1980s, what you see that there is a lack of demand of oil as it was as compared to what was there in the previous decade, and there was a shift from the OPEC countries to other oil importing countries. Essentially, what happened in this period, the early 1980s, OPEC realized that its market share was falling heavily and the total petroleum revenue dropped below one third of its earlier peaks. So the revenue suffered like anything. This caused severe economic hardship in many of the member countries, because if you look at the member countries of OPEC, most of the countries, their economy is revolving, or started revolving around this business of oil. So the moment you suffer from a lack of revenue from this oil, the whole economy suffers. So this was a very crucial juncture at which the OPEC was standing, and they really had to do something. So what did the OPEC do? OPEC decided to introduce a group production ceiling divided among the member countries. So the member countries would have quota, and there will be a group production ceiling. As we have already discussed that Saudi Arabia is one of the big players in OPEC, at that point of time, Saudi Arabia, they chose to act as the swing producer. So whatever their production behavior will actually have a great impact in the production behavior of the OPEC countries, and it will always have the power to influence the price. However, despite all this effort, the market share of non-OPEC countries started increasing at this point of time. Now, when you see, if you look at the OPEC countries, they had a severe discontent with the whole thing, because they saw they are not going to produce what they want to produce. There is a quota imposed to them. At the same time, they are not being able to gain the market share. So this kind of discontent actually kind of forced some of the member countries to act in a different manner, to deviate from this ceiling divided among the members. And the first one was Saudi Arabia. They decided not to support any production cut. They said we are going on with our production anyway. The price is falling, so in that case, if we reduce our production, there is a huge revenue loss. But as you remember, the Saudi Arabia was the swing member. I mean, it actually decided the course of price and production. The moment Saudi Arabia deviated and started increasing its production, there was a sharp decline in price. So there was a oversupply, huge oversupply in the market, and there was a sharp fall in price. So in 1981, if you remember, the price of oil rose up to 34 US dollar per barrel. In 1986, in the 5 year period of time, it dropped at $7 US dollar per barrel. Okay, so this was called the third oil price shock in a negative manner, or this was a sort of a counter shock. So see, although you see that the price is falling, but there's this huge fluctuation in oil price. So this kind of price fluctuation is not good for the health of any kind of market. What else did OPEC do? A reference basket for pricing was actually set up by OPEC at this point of time, and this helped somewhat to recover the price at the later phase of 1980s. There was one important thing, because the market share of non-OPEC countries were increasing. It was important that OPEC, starts having a dialogue with these people, and there was a significant progress with OPEC and non-OPEC country dialogue and cooperation, and this was perceived to be an essential element for market stability and reasonable prices. Finally, we are not finally. I mean, after 1980s, we are going to see what happened in 1990s. But before we directly go to what OPEC did, we have to have a quick look at 1990s, which is one of the very important deciding era in the world history. So the moment we say 1990s, the first thing that probably comes to our mind is the process of liberalization. So that characterized the economic process. There were a lot of political turmoil that was going on. The collapse was USSR was witnessed in 1990s, and Russia was producing a lot of oil. So there was, the moment USSR declined in the the first 5 years at least, there was a sharp decline in the production, or in some parts actually the production stopped in Russia. So suddenly there was a sharp fall in the supply of oil in the world. However, now that the OPEC has gained the market power as a big supplier, or as a big sort of having a big share of production, USSR was an important player, but not as important as the OPEC countries. There was geopolitical unrest in the Middle East countries as well. The Iraq, invaded Kuwait, and there was subsequent war. So a lot of political turmoil and upheaval was going on in the Middle East countries as well. And finally, strikes the Asian economic crisis in 1997, and it had the impact on the rest of the world, which reduced the demand. So you see that 1990s, although the liberalization, raised the hope that the demand for there will be more activities in the countries, there will be more, demand for oil. Finally, what happened? The early years of 1997, at least till the mid, or the entire 1990s, I would say, experienced a fall in the supply and a fall in the demand as well. So this is the period of a depression economy that you can see, at least to the later part of 1990s. How did OPEC work? And as usual, this had an impact on the price. How did the OPEC decided to work on this? OPEC worked through the quota adjustment among the member countries, and they tried to adjust the supply to compensate the fall in demand. Price moved. I mean, there was price volatility in 1990s, but they were not as dramatic as 1970s and 1980s. There were not many shocks that had been observed at that period of time. This, however, as you see that there was a price volatility, the price remained low. This, however, discouraged the investment in the oil sector, especially by the non-OPEC countries who were relatively smaller players and had to recover their costs. So, and this some, according to some of the experts, this is the kind of a very subtle phenomena, this kind of subtle phenomena, and uninterested being uninterested in investment, this continued afterwards. I mean, probably this the oil market could never, the oil industry could never recover this kind of economic shock that it experienced in 1990s. The last point that I have here actually taken from the OPEC's website directly, it says that as the United Nations sponsored climate change negotiations gathered momentum after the Earth Summit of 1992, OPEC sought fairness, balance, and realism in the treatment of oil supply. So, what happens at this period of time is that OPEC realizes that it cannot only act as a protector of the interest of the oil petroleum exporting countries, especially in Middle East, but there is another lobby which is coming up who is trying to and talking about climate change mitigation. And if you talk about climate change mitigation, you also have to talk about how you can reduce the use of oil. So, the position of OPEC in the global scenario, it had to be reoriented a little bit. So if you again you go to the the OPEC website, interestingly you see that whenever they are talking about the post 90s, they also take into consideration how they can be a player in environmental damage control, in climate change mitigation, and so on. However, the guidelines are not very clearly defined, but these words started appearing in the website of OPEC. We are going to stop after having a very brief and quick discussion on what happened in the last 2 decades. So there was no significant price shock that we say. There are ups and downs in the prices. 2014, observed one. There were some sort of era where there was price stabilization and so on. So in a nutshell, if you want to follow it, the best way is probably go to the newspapers, follow the newspapers and so on, because there are so many things, small things, big things that had happened during the past 2 decades. It will take a very long period of time to go to a detailed discussion. So what happened in a nutshell? Finally, we are going to see very briefly what happened in past 2 decades. A lot of things happened, although there were not oil price shocks at 1973 or 1979, but there were fluctuations in price to great extent during this period of time as well. So we are going to have a small discussion on that. But if you're really interested, get interested in the oil pricing and the behavior of OPEC, it's best to follow their website, and it's also interesting to follow the regular news is what is going on in the field, right? For example, I can say that in the recent years there is a very high concern from the OPEC member countries that the share of export of the OPEC countries has declined over the past couple of years to great extent, and how that can be recovered. Anyway, if you look at the past 2 decades, that is from 2000 onward, OPEC really worked in the front of price fixing. So the era of posted price was gone. They initiated an innovative scheme, which was the band mechanism, and that helped the strengthening and stabilizing of the crude oil price in the early years of the 2000 and so on. And the impact was immediately seen. Since 2002, the price started rising after remaining very, very low during the post economic recession period, that is post 1997. So after 1997, the first true increase was observed in 2002. However, the oversupply continued. So this oversupply remained a perennial problem in the international oil market. And as the oversupply continued, it again drove the price down. Oil was used increasingly as an asset class. As a result, the demand increased and the recovery was price was observed in after a couple of years, and the price soared to a record level in mid 2008. So that was in during those years, that was the record peak that was achieved by the crude oil price. However, it was followed by a sharp collapse in the oil price in 2014 onwards, following the global recession and financial crisis. Not only the recession and financial crisis, there was escalating social unrest in many parts of the world that affected the supply and demand throughout the initial years of the past 2 decades. Although it would be said that the world market in terms of supply and demand and price remained relatively stable as compared to what was observed in the previous decades. There was an important or interesting thing that happened on the demand front. A lot of demand for oil started coming from the developing world, especially from China and India, and the share of demand from the OECD countries started declining. And especially from 2000 to 2010, we'll see that the demand for oil grew extensively from India and China. So this gave a boost. So this kind of demand increase actually increased the price of oil as well. That was one of the impetus that increased the price of oil at that period of time. So from 1990 to 2008, the price of crude oil was increased from 25 US dollar per barrel to more than 160 US dollar per barrel. And two reasons that are usually identified: one was the supply cut from the Saudi, and the other is the growing demand from India, China, and some of the other developing countries. But this increasing trend continued only up to 2014, and after 2014 there was again a sharp fall in the price. So why was the sharp fall? So it was said that, see, I mean, the developing countries, they were in a boom and growing trajectory in the early years. So the kind of demand that for oil that comes in the early years of development, it has to die down a little bit in the coming years, and that is exactly what happened with respect to the demand for oil that was coming from India and China. So we saw that the prices were stable between 2011 and mid 2014. However, there was a huge or sharp decline in price in 2014. After that, the price again recovered, and if you look at the very recent trend, then you will see there is a declining trend of price as well. So, if we want to summarize our discussion of the OPEC behavior, we can see that OPEC actually marks a transition from the agreements between some private oil companies to an agreement between the nation states. And this is a much more stronger agreements to have a monopoly power in the world oil market for a very long period of time, not only with a decisive power to supply, but also with the decisive power to sort of determine the price. If you do simple internet search, you will see how the price of oil actually moved together with the supply decision of Saudi Arabia. So it's often said that the supply of oil in the international market depends on what production decision the Saudi Arabia takes. So even within the OPEC, there are dominant players and so on. If you are interested, you can also explore the oligopolistic market structure, where there is a monopoly power with a group of people or a group of nations, and how they are delegating this power among the member nations. This is one thing that we observe. We also observe that after OPEC comes into the picture, after OPEC exerts its monopoly power, there was a sharp increase in the price of oil. And although there are fluctuations, the supply glut, often cases, the depressed the price. Wherever the increase in price was mainly came as a result of distribution of quota fixing the price ceiling by the OPEC countries, and also through increase in demand in the certain parts of world. Now, studying OPEC behavior is one in itself is a huge study area. If you get interested, it's actually a very sort of interesting to follow what is happening in OPEC, how the prices are moving, and so on. And it gives you a lot of research opportunity as well. A lot of people working in the time series data do actually work on the data in the world, in the oil market. So this is where we are going to end this lecture, and in the next lecture we will explore some interesting topics which are revolving around energy economics and policy. Thank you.